Abigail Turner buried her husband with her own 2 hands. No preacher, no neighbors, no tears left to cry. And before the dirt had even dried on Thomas's grave, 3 men rode onto her land and told her she had 3 days to disappear. She didn't run. She didn't beg. She picked up a shovel and stared them down like she had nothing left to lose, because she didn't. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel, follow till the very end, and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The summer of 1874 was the kind that cracked the earth open and didn't apologize for it. Abigail Turner had been digging for 2 hours. The ground behind the cabin was harder than she expected, baked solid from 3 weeks without rain, and her arms burned from the shoulders down. Blisters had broken on her right palm, somewhere around the 1st foot. She hadn't stopped, hadn't looked up. The shovel rang against stone, and she worked around it, breathing through her teeth, sweat soaking clean through the black mourning dress she'd pulled from the cedar chest that morning, the same dress she'd worn to her mother's funeral 6 years before. Thomas was wrapped in a canvas tarp she'd sewn shut herself. She hadn't been able to look at his face when she did it. The bullet had entered just below his left ear. He'd been standing at the fence line, both hands visible, not even armed. The men who rode away after had been laughing. She'd heard that from the window. She hadn't been able to move fast enough. By the time she got to the porch, he was already on the ground, and the riders were already specks at the end of the road. She'd held his head in her lap for a long time. Then she'd gone inside, made coffee she didn't drink, sat in his chair until the light changed, and in the morning, she started digging. Nobody came from town. She hadn't expected anyone to. Red Ridge, Wyoming, had made its position on the Turner family plain enough over the past 8 months. Ever since Thomas had refused to sign over the grazing rights to the creek that ran through the eastern edge of their 40 acres. Since then, the feed store had stopped extending them credit. The pastor had stopped visiting. 2 families they'd called friends had crossed the street rather than speak to them at the Saturday market. Money had a long reach in the valley, and Victor Calloway had more of it than God. Abigail drove the last shovelful of earth and packed it flat with the back of the blade. She stood there a moment, hands on the handle, looking down at the mound of dark soil against the pale, dry ground. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she said quietly. "I'm sorry I didn't get there faster." The wind pushed at her back like it was trying to move her along. She didn't move. "You were the best man I ever knew," she thought. "And they killed you for 40 acres and a creek." She heard the hoofbeats before she saw them. 3 horses coming up the road from the south, moving at a deliberate pace that said they weren't in a hurry because they didn't need to be. She turned around slowly, still holding the shovel. Ethan Pike led them. She recognized him by the gray hat and the way he sat a horse like he owned everything under it. Calloway's foreman. The man who'd been delivering messages to their door since October. First polite ones, then less polite ones. He had a face that had been handsome once and had since decided cruelty suited it better. He pulled up at the edge of the yard and looked from Abigail to the fresh grave and back again. And something in his expression shifted, not to sympathy, but to a kind of satisfied calculation. "Mrs. Turner," he said. "Pike?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper and tossed it. It landed in the dirt 2 feet from the grave mound. "What is that?" she said. She didn't move to pick it up. "Land notice. Filed this morning with the county clerk." He laced his fingers over the saddle horn. "Mr. Calloway's been real patient with your situation. Given everything that's happened, he's prepared to be generous. You've got 3 days to vacate the property. Personal belongings only. The structure and the land revert to Calloway Ranch under the terms of the debt your husband carried." Thomas didn't carry a debt with Calloway. He carried one with the Red Ridge Agricultural Bank. Pike smiled slightly. Mr. Calloway purchased that note 2 weeks ago. It's all in the paperwork. Abigail looked at the paper in the dirt. Then she looked at Pike. You rode out here, she said slowly, on the day I buried my husband. You rode out here today to hand me that. Business doesn't pause for grief, ma'am. No, she said. I reckon it doesn't. She set the tip of the shovel against the ground and leaned on the handle, and she looked at Ethan Pike the way you look at something you've already decided about. You go back to Victor Calloway, she said, and you tell him that if he wants this land, he's going to have to dig another hole right beside Thomas's. You understand me? Tell him he'll have to bury me on it. One of the riders behind Pike shifted in his saddle and exchanged a look with the other. Pike didn't react. He just watched her for a moment, the way a man watches something he's already factoring into a longer plan. 3 days, Mrs. Turner, he said. Then he pulled his horse around, and the three of them rode back down the road the way they'd come, easy and unhurried, like men who've already won the hand and are just letting the other player figure it out. Abigail stood in the yard until the dust settled. Then she picked up the land notice from the dirt, folded it again without reading it, and walked back inside. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's old rifle across her lap, and the land notice spread open under the oil lamp, reading it 3 times. The legal language was dense and carefully constructed. Whoever had drafted it had been paid well to make theft look like paperwork. The agricultural banknote was real. She hadn't known about it. Thomas had never told her, which meant he'd either been ashamed or he'd been trying to protect her from worrying. And either way, it didn't matter now, because the note had been purchased and the clock was running. 3 days. She pressed her palm flat against the table. This was Thomas's table. He'd built it the first winter, cursing at the wood when it split wrong, laughing at himself when the legs came out uneven. They'd eaten every meal of their marriage at this table. She told him about the baby they'd lost at this table, and he'd held her hands and cried with her, and they hadn't spoken for a long time. And then he'd said, "We'll try again, Abby. Long as we've got each other, we'll keep trying." They hadn't gotten the chance. She folded the land notice and put it in the tin box under the floorboard with their savings, $31.40. And she set the rifle against the wall and blew out the lamp. In the dark, she made herself a list. She needed a lawyer, which meant she needed money she didn't have. She needed witnesses to what had been done to Thomas, which meant she needed people in Red Ridge willing to speak, which meant she needed something she was almost certain didn't exist in this valley anymore. Someone who wasn't afraid of Victor Calloway. She closed her eyes. She did not pray. She hadn't been able to since October, since the first time Pike had come to the door with his polite smile and his veiled threats. And she'd watched Thomas shake the man's hand and smile back, and then close the door and stand with his forehead against it for a long time. She'd known then that God wasn't running Red Ridge. Money was. She was at the well before sunrise, hauling the first bucket of the morning, when she heard a sound at the tree line. Not hoofbeats, something quieter. A horse shifting its weight, a branch settling. She straightened up slowly with the bucket in both hands and looked toward the cottonwoods at the north edge of the property. There was a man on horseback just inside the tree line. He'd been there a while, she thought. The horse was relaxed. Abigail set the bucket down and stood to her full height. "I can see you," she called. A pause. Then the horse walked forward, out of the trees and into the morning light, and the man on it touched the brim of his hat. He was older than she'd first thought, maybe 34, 35. Lean in the way of men who'd spent years working rather than eating. He wore a long duster that had seen better decades, a hat that had been black once and was now the color of road dust, and he had a rifle across the saddle that she recognized as a 44-40 Winchester, the long-range kind. He had the kind of face that didn't volunteer anything. "Ma'am," he said. "You've been sitting in those trees since yesterday," she said. It wasn't a question. "Since the afternoon, yes, ma'am." "You watched those men ride up?" "I did." "And you watched them ride away?" "I did." She studied him. He held still under her examination without any apparent discomfort. "You a bounty hunter?" she asked. "No, ma'am." "You work for Calloway?" Something moved through his eyes. "No." "Then what are you doing on my property?" He was quiet for a moment, looking past her at the fresh grave, then back at her face. "Passing through," he said. "Saw what happened. Thought I'd stay close in case it happened again before morning." "That's a considerable amount of concern from a stranger passing through." "Yes, ma'am. I reckon it is." She looked at him a moment longer. He didn't fill the silence with anything, which she found unusual. Men who had something to prove always talked too much. This one seemed comfortable with the quiet in a way that suggested he'd spent a great deal of time alone. "Cole Hawkins," he said finally, "if it helps." "It doesn't yet," she said. "Abigail Turner." "I know." "How?" "Asked at the last town I came through. Heard there was trouble out on the East Homestead. Heard a woman was holding a piece of land against Calloway." He paused. "Heard her husband got shot." She felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her face still. "That's a lot of hearing for a man passing through," she said. "I suppose it is." She picked up her water bucket. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, "I appreciate what you think you were doing last night, but I don't have money to pay a hired gun. I don't have food to spare for an extra mouth, and I don't have the trust to give a stranger the run of my property." She looked up at him. "So I'll say, thank you for your concern, and good morning." She turned and walked back toward the cabin. She heard him dismount behind her. "Mrs. Turner." She stopped, didn't turn around. "I'm not asking for pay," he said, "and I ate yesterday. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm just telling you that those men are going to come back, and when they do, they're going to come at night, and there's going to be more of them. And a woman alone." She turned around. "Finish that sentence very carefully," she said. He closed his mouth, opened it again. "A person alone," he said, "is at a disadvantage against 6 men with torches." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she asked. "Ma'am?" "Why do you care what happens to this piece of land, or the woman standing on it? You don't know me. You've got no stake in this valley. Men like you, drifters, they ride around trouble, not toward it. So why?" Cole Hawkins looked down at the brim of his hat for a moment, turning it slowly in his hands. "I rode through a town called Millhaven 2 years back," he said, "in Colorado. Fella named Garrett was doing the same thing Calloway's doing, buying up debt, running people off. I saw a family leave their homestead with a wagon and 3 kids, and the look on that woman's face." He stopped. "I kept riding, told myself it wasn't my business." He looked up at her. "I've been thinking about that woman's face a long time, Mrs. Turner." The silence between them stretched. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the field. The early light was turning gold. "There's a bucket by the pump," Abigail said finally, "and a hammer and nails in the lean-to. The east fence has been cut 3 times this month." She held his gaze. "Fix it, and we'll talk further." She went inside. He was still there at noon. She watched him from the window while she made cornbread, or rather, watched the top of his hat moving along the fence line, the regular sound of the hammer carrying back across the yard. He worked steadily, without rushing, pausing occasionally to check the work from a distance, the way a man did when he actually cared whether something held. Thomas had worked like that. She pushed the thought away and put the bread in the oven. When she carried a plate and a cup of coffee out to the fence at midday, he was on his knees setting a post, the duster folded over the top rail. He stood when he heard her coming. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You didn't have to fix my fence," she said. She held out the plate. He took it, and they stood at the fence line in the white heat of the summer noon, and she looked at the work he'd done. Solid, careful, the kind of work that would hold. And she said nothing for a moment.
"How long have you been drifting?" she asked.
"Since the war ended." "That's 9 years." "Yes, ma'am." "What were you before the war?" "A farmer's son, Kentucky." He took a drink of the coffee. "There wasn't much to go back to." She nodded slowly. "Thomas was the same," she said. "Ohio originally. Came west after Appomattox. Said the land back east felt like it was holding its breath. Couldn't stand to be somewhere so quiet after everything." She looked out across the valley. "He loved it out here. Said it was too big to be sad in." Cole looked at the grave. "He sounds like a good man," he said. "He was the best one I knew." Her voice stayed level. "That's why they killed him. The good ones don't bend." Cole set his cup down on the fence post. "Mrs. Turner," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer straight." "All right." "Do you have proof of any of it? The note purchase, what happened to Thomas, any of it?" "Thomas kept records. Receipts from the bank, letters from Calloway, 2 written notices Pike delivered by hand. I've got them in a tin box." "That's something." He paused. "You've got a lawyer?" "Can't afford one." "Who's the county attorney?" "Man named Whitfield. He's in Calloway's pocket, same as the sheriff." "Same as Sheriff Brooks?" She looked at him. "You know Daniel Brooks?" "I know of him. Heard he was a decent man once." "He was," she said, "before Calloway bought his election." She paused. "He's not a bad man. He's a frightened one. There's a difference, maybe. I don't know anymore." Cole was quiet, looking at the fence, running a thumb along the top rail. "Frightened men sometimes remember who they are," he said, "when it costs them too much to keep forgetting." She looked at him. "You sound like a man who's been one," she said. He didn't answer that. He picked up the hammer and went back to work. The second evening, he made camp at the tree line again, declined her offer of the barn, said he slept better outside, which she didn't entirely believe, but respected. She brought him a blanket roll and a second cup of coffee, and they stood at the edge of the trees in the cooling dusk, and she asked him about the rifle. "You could have stopped Pike yesterday," she said. "From the tree line. You had the angle." "Yes, ma'am." "But you didn't." "Shooting a man for delivering a paper isn't justice," he said. "It's just more killing." She turned her cup in her hands. "What is justice, then, out here?" she asked. "Out here, where the law belongs to the man with the most land." Cole looked at the darkening sky. "Justice is making it cost more than it's worth," he said. "Calloway's used to people leaving quietly, running scared. Every day you stay on this land, every fence that gets repaired, every morning those riders come back and find you still standing here. That costs him something." He looked at her. "Not money, something worse. He starts to look like a man who can't get what he wants. And out here, that's everything." Abigail was quiet. "He'll escalate," she said. "He will." "It'll get worse before it gets better." "Considerably." She looked at him. "And you'll stay through that?" He met her gaze. "I'll stay through that." She nodded once and started back toward the cabin. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, without turning around. "Ma'am?" "There's a loaded shotgun inside the door. If anyone comes up the road after midnight tonight, you fire twice into the air, and I'll be at the window." She paused. "I shoot reasonably well." "I believe that," he said. She went inside and closed the door. He settled his back against the cottonwood and listened to the valley. Somewhere out in the dark, the cicadas were loud and steady, the sound of summer refusing to end. And Cole Hawkins sat with his rifle across his knees and thought about a woman in Millhaven, Colorado, whose face he hadn't been able to stop seeing. And he looked at the small lighted window of the cabin and the grave mound dark against the pale earth, and he thought, not this time. Not again. The stars came out one by one over Wyoming. He stayed awake until morning. 3 days passed without incident, and that was the most frightening thing of all. Abigail knew Ethan Pike well enough by now to understand that silence wasn't mercy. Silence was preparation. Every morning she woke before dawn and listened to the house and counted the sounds. The creak of the well chain, Cole's horse shifting at the tree line, the distant lowing of the 2 cattle she had left. Every morning the count came back normal, and every morning she trusted it a little less. On the 4th morning, she walked out to find Cole already at the fence with a cup of coffee and a look on his face that said he'd been thinking something over for a while. "They haven't come back," she said. "No, ma'am." "That bothers you?" "It does." She crossed her arms. "What do you think they're doing?" "I think they're letting you sit with it," he said. "Let the quiet work on you. Let you start wondering whether it's worth it. Whether you'd be better off taking whatever Calloway's offering and starting over somewhere else." He set his cup on the post. "It's what I'd do if I were running this." "You'd frighten a widow off her land with silence." "I'd use every tool available," he said plainly. "I'm just telling you what they're thinking." She looked out toward the road. "It won't work," she said. "I know it won't." He picked up the hammer. "But they don't know that yet." She went back inside and pulled Thomas's tin box from under the floorboard and spread the papers across the table for the 4th time that week. The banknote, the letters, 2 delivery receipts signed by Pike himself. She'd been turning these documents over in her hands like they were puzzle pieces that should fit together into something a judge would care about. But every time she arranged them, she came back to the same wall. A county attorney in Calloway's employ, a sheriff who'd stopped answering her letters, and a courthouse 40 miles north in Cheyenne that might as well have been on the moon. She needed someone to take these papers to Cheyenne. She needed someone Calloway couldn't stop or buy. She was still staring at the table when she heard the wagon coming up the road. She was at the window with Thomas's rifle before she'd made a conscious decision to move. Cole came around from the fence line at a low jog, hand on his sidearm. But the wagon that pulled through the gate was a single horse, an open buckboard, and the woman driving it was someone Abigail hadn't expected. Mary Caldwell, the schoolteacher from Red Ridge, pulled her horse up in the yard and climbed down with the careful movements of a woman who'd made a decision that frightened her and had decided to go through with it anyway. She was 40-something, spare and straight-backed, with gray threaded through her dark hair and eyes that were sharp and tired in equal measure. She looked at Cole standing at the fence with his hand near his gun, and then at Abigail on the porch with her rifle, and she said, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I can't keep not coming." Abigail lowered the rifle. "Mary." "I should have come sooner." Her voice was tight. "I know that. Believe me, I know that. But I have a position at that school, and Calloway funds it, and I have 6 children who depend on me to show up every morning, so She stopped. "I'm sorry, Abigail. That's not good enough. I know it isn't." "Come inside," Abigail said. Cole stayed on the porch. Inside, Mary sat at the table and pressed both hands flat against the wood, like she needed to feel something solid. And she talked for 20 minutes without stopping. She talked about the night Thomas was shot. She'd been at the edge of town, and she'd seen the riders come back. She'd recognized Ethan Pike's gray hat. She'd seen the blood on one man's sleeve. She talked about Victor Calloway coming into the schoolhouse 3 days later and standing in the doorway and telling her that this was a difficult time for the community, and that people who helped stir up trouble during difficult times sometimes found their positions reconsidered. She talked about how she'd gone home that night and sat in the dark and told herself there was nothing she could do. "But I've been a coward," she said, "and I'm done with it. I'll write down everything I saw. I'll sign it. I'll take it to whoever needs to read it." Abigail looked at the papers on the table. "Mary," she said carefully, "if you do this, he will come after your position. He may come after worse." "I know. You'd lose the school." "I know that too." Mary met her eyes. "Abigail, those children are going to grow up in this valley. What am I teaching them if I keep my job by watching what's right get swallowed up?" She shook her head. "Thomas Turner was a good man. He deserved better than what this town gave him. And you deserve better than what you're getting." Abigail was quiet for a moment. Then she pushed the bank papers across the table toward Mary. "Tell me what you saw. Everything. Start from the beginning." They were still at the table 2 hours later when Cole knocked on the doorframe and said, quietly, "Rider coming. Single horse. Coming from town." Abigail was on her feet before he finished the sentence. The rider turned out to be a boy. Couldn't have been more than 16. A ranch hand from the look of his boots. Riding a sweat-darkened horse like he'd pushed it hard to get here. He pulled up in the yard and looked at Cole with nervous eyes, and then passed him at Abigail on the porch. "Mrs. Turner?" he said. "That's right. My name's Jesse Pratt. I worked at Calloway Ranch." He swallowed. "I need to talk to you." Cole looked at Abigail. She nodded. The boy got down from his horse and stood in the yard, turning his hat in his hands. And the story he told came out in broken pieces, like something that had been building pressure for a long time, and finally found a crack. He'd been on the Calloway payroll for 2 years. He'd overheard conversations he wasn't meant to hear. He knew that the banknote had been purchased specifically to manufacture grounds for eviction. He knew that the order to drive Thomas Turner off the land had come directly from Calloway, delivered verbally to Pike in the ranch office on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks before Thomas was shot. He hadn't seen the shooting himself, but he'd heard Pike come back and report to Calloway, and he'd heard Calloway say, "Good, make sure the widow is out by the end of the month." The yard was absolutely silent. "Why are you telling me this?" Abigail said. The boy looked at his hat. "Because I got a mother about your age, ma'am, and because I've been sick about it since the day it happened." He looked up. "And because Pike hit me this morning for dropping a saddle, and I figured if I was going to get myself in trouble anyway, it might as well be for something that counted." Cole stepped forward and put his hand on the boy's shoulder briefly, the way an older man does when something doesn't need words. "You're going to have to say this in writing," Abigail said, "in front of witnesses, and you're going to have to say it again in front of a judge if it comes to that." "I know," Jesse said. "I'll do it." She looked at him for a moment, young, frightened, decided. "Mary," she called toward the house, "bring the paper." By late afternoon, Abigail had 2 signed statements and a plan that was beginning to look less like desperation and more like something that might actually work. What she needed now was a way to get those papers north to the territorial court in Cheyenne without Calloway's people intercepting them. Because if he heard that witnesses were talking, The first thing he'd do was make sure those witnesses stopped. She put the question to Cole directly, standing in the yard after Jesse Pratt had ridden off toward wherever boys go when they've just burned their safest bridge. "I can ride to Cheyenne," Cole said. 3 days. 4 at most. "If you leave this property—" "I know. He'll move the moment you're gone. He's been waiting for you to leave."
"I know that too." She looked at him.
"So you can't go," she said. "No, ma'am." "Then who?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is there anyone in this town who isn't afraid of Calloway? Anyone at all?" She thought about it. Really thought about it. Going through Red Ridge name by name, the way you go through a deck of cards looking for a particular suit. "Daniel Brooks," she said finally. Cole raised an eyebrow. "The sheriff," she said. "I know what I said before. I know he's been compromised. But Mary says he's been drinking more than usual since Thomas was killed. And a man who can't sleep through what he's done is a man who hasn't finished deciding who he is." She paused. "Maybe you were right. Maybe the cost is getting too high for him to keep forgetting." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "I'll go talk to him." "He might arrest you." "On what grounds?" "Calloway doesn't need grounds." "No," Cole agreed, "but Brooks might." He picked up his hat from the fence post.
"A man who still cares about grounds is a man worth talking to."
She watched him saddle his horse with quick, economical movements. "Cole," she said. He looked at her over the horse's back. "Be careful," she said. It came out simpler and more direct than she'd intended, and she didn't take it back. He nodded, swung up, rode south toward Red Ridge. She stood at the fence until she couldn't see him anymore. Then she went inside and checked the shotgun and sat down at the table and did not let herself think about what would happen if he didn't come back. The afternoon ground past. The heat sat on the cabin like a hand. She was at the window at dusk when she heard 2 horses on the road, and her stomach dropped because 2 horses meant either Cole had come back with someone, or Cole hadn't come back at all, and someone else had. It was Cole, and beside him, on a sorrel horse with a badge catching the last of the light, was Sheriff Daniel Brooks. She met them in the yard. Brooks was a solid man in his 50s, with a heavy gray mustache and eyes that looked like they hadn't had a full night's rest since the spring. He got down from his horse with the careful movements of a man who was carrying more weight than his body accounted for, and he took off his hat and held it in both hands, and looked at Abigail with an expression that was the most complicated she'd seen on a lawman's face. "Mrs. Turner," he said, "I owe you an apology. I owe your husband's memory one, too, and I know that doesn't fix anything." "No," she said, "it doesn't." "I know." He nodded slowly. "Your friend here has a persuasive way of making a man look at himself." He glanced at Cole, then back at her. "I'd like to see what you've got. The documents, the statements, all of it." She studied him. "And then what?" she asked. "And then I'm going to ride to Cheyenne myself," he said. "Tonight. Before I change my mind, and before Calloway gets word that I'm thinking about changing it." He met her eyes. "I've been a coward, Mrs. Turner. I'm not saying I wasn't. But I still know the difference between law and what Victor Calloway calls law, and I've been mixing them up long enough that I can't sleep in the same room as myself anymore." The silence in the yard was the kind that meant something was shifting, some weight redistributing itself, some scale tipping. "Come inside," Abigail said. She put every document on the table. The banknote, the letters, the receipts, Mary's signed statement, Jesse Pratt's account. She watched Brooks read each one slowly, his face doing things she couldn't entirely interpret. and when he finished, he sat back and put both hands flat on the table. "This is enough," he said. "This is more than enough." "Will they listen to you in Cheyenne?" Cole asked from the doorway. "I'm still the county sheriff," Brooks said, "for whatever that's worth anymore." He started organizing the papers carefully.
And I know 2 men on the territorial court who haven't been bought yet. I've been saving that knowledge for something that mattered. He looked at Abigail. This matters. He was back on his horse inside 20 minutes, the papers wrapped in oilskin inside his coat, the expression on his face that of a man who'd made a decision he should have made months ago and was riding fast to make up for the delay. Cole stood beside Abigail, and they watched the sheriff ride south into the dark. "Do you trust him?" she asked. "I trust that he's too tired of himself to turn back," Cole said. "That's not the same as trust, but it's enough for tonight." She nodded, started back toward the door. "Mrs. Turner," she stopped. "You should sleep tonight," he said. "Real sleep. I'll watch the road." She stood with her hand on the doorframe. "They'll come soon," she said. "Once Calloway hears Brooks rode north, and he will hear, probably by morning, he won't wait any more." "I know." "It'll be bad." "Yes, ma'am." She turned and looked at him standing in the yard in the last of the evening light. And she thought about Thomas. And she thought about the woman in Millhaven whose face had followed this man for 2 years across the frontier. And she thought about what it cost a person to keep going back toward the thing that frightened them most. "Why Wyoming?" she asked. "Of all the valleys to pass through." Cole looked at the grave mound for a moment. "Heard there was a woman holding a piece of land she shouldn't have been able to hold," he said. "Figured that was worth seeing." She held his gaze. "Good night, Mr. Hawkins," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Turner." She went inside, bolted the door, lay down on top of the blankets fully dressed, with the shotgun beside her, and Thomas's rifle against the wall, and $31 in a tin box under the floor. She closed her eyes. For the first time in a week, she slept. Outside, Cole Hawkins settled his back against the cottonwood and watched the road with his rifle across his knees. And somewhere south in the dark, Victor Calloway sat in his office and received the news that Daniel Brooks had ridden north before midnight. And the expression that moved across his face was not anger. It was the cold, flat calculation of a man who has decided that patience is finished. He called for Ethan Pike. Calloway called for Pike at midnight. That was the piece of information that reached Abigail's door before sunrise, delivered by Jesse Pratt on a lathered horse, the boy's face white under his tan, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, even though there was no one within half a mile to hear him. "I was in the bunkhouse," he said. "Thin walls. I heard Pike come in, and I heard Calloway say—" He swallowed. "He said, 'Finish it. Tonight. No more notices, no more waiting. Finish it, and make it look like an accident.'" Cole was already pulling on his coat. "How many men?" he said. "6, maybe 7. Pike's been drinking since sundown, and that makes him worse, not better." Jesse looked at Abigail. "Mrs. Turner, I'm sorry I couldn't get here faster. I came the minute I heard." "You did right," she said. She was already moving, to the shelf for shells, to the window to check the road, to the table to think. "Go to Mary Caldwell's house. Don't stop anywhere else. Don't talk to anyone." "I want to stay and help." "Jesse," her voice was firm, "if something happens to you, we lose your testimony. You were the only person who heard Calloway give that order with his own mouth. That makes you more valuable than a rifle right now." She met his eyes. "Go." He went. Cole was at the window with his rifle, running through the load with quick, practiced movements. "We can't hold 7 men," Abigail said. "I know. Not with 2 guns and 1 barn." "I know that too.
He looked at her.
But we don't have to win a battle tonight. We just have to survive it long enough for what Brooks is carrying to matter. That's a considerable thing to just... Yes, ma'am. She checked the shotgun. Loaded. Both barrels. She set it on the table and picked up Thomas's rifle and checked that too. And the act of checking it, the weight of it, the familiar cold metal, did something steady to her hands. "Cole," she said without looking up. "Ma'am?" "If it goes badly tonight, if something happens to me, the tin box is under the third floorboard from the east wall. There's enough in it to get to Cheyenne. Make sure Jesse's statement gets there." He crossed the room in 3 steps and stood in front of her and waited until she looked at him. "Nothing is going to happen to you," he said. Quiet. Absolute. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded and went to the window. The road was empty. The night was thick and still, the kind of stillness that had weight to it, and the stars were so bright they cast faint shadows. "They'll come dark," Cole said. "No torches until they're on the property. They want noise last, not first." "The barn," she said. "They'll go for the barn first. Thomas's horse is in there." "I know. I'm going to move her." He stopped at the door. "Bar this behind me. Don't open it for anything except my voice." "I know how to do this." "I know you do." He paused in the doorway. "That's not why I said it." She looked at him. He went out. She barred the door. The minutes that followed were the longest of Abigail Turner's life, and she had already lived through some very long minutes. She stood at the east window with the rifle and listened to Cole moving in the barn, and then the quiet sound of the horse being let out the far side, and then nothing, and then more nothing. And she counted her own breaths to keep from losing track of time. She heard them before she saw them. Not hoofbeats, smart enough to muffle those. What she heard was the creak of saddle leather and a man clearing his throat some 50 yards out. The sounds of men who were careful, but not careful enough. And her whole body went electric and tight and sharp. She pulled back from the window. "Cole," she said, low, toward the back wall. From somewhere outside, close, closer than she expected, his voice came back, just above a whisper. "I hear them. Stay down." 6 of them came through the gate. She saw them through the east window, dark shapes moving in dark space, and she could make out the gray hat in the middle of the group that meant Ethan Pike was riding point. They spread as they entered the yard, 2 breaking toward the barn, 2 circling left toward the well, 2 riding straight for the cabin. And everything in her focused down to a single, cold point. The 2 headed for the barn slowed when they found it already open and empty. She heard one of them say something, too quiet to make out. Then a torch came out. The flame bloomed yellow-orange against the dark, and everything happened at once. Abigail came up from below the windowsill and put the rifle barrel through the gap in the shutter and aimed at the torch and fired. And the torch flew sideways from the man's hand, and he shouted something that was mostly a curse. And from somewhere at the north edge of the yard, Cole's rifle cracked once, sharp and flat as a board breaking, and one of the men near the well pitched sideways off his horse. "The barn!" Pike was shouting. "Get the barn!" "Cole got the east man," Abigail called toward the window. "Get down!" She was already down. Buckshot hit the cabin wall, the other side, southeast corner, and she heard the window shutter on that side crack under the impact, and she scrambled across the floor, keeping below sill height, and came up on the west side, and looked out to find one of Pike's men fumbling with a second torch on horseback, not 20 feet out. She leveled the shotgun and fired, both barrels. The horse veered hard, and the man went down in the dirt, and the torch went sideways into the open ground between the cabin and the fence, and burned itself out against the dry earth. She broke the shotgun and reloaded with hands that were shaking but fast. "Hawkins!" Pike's voice, loud now, anger overtaking strategy. "I know you're out there, Hawkins. You've got no stake in this. Ride away right now and Calloway will let you walk. Stay, and you're a dead man." Silence. Then Cole's voice from somewhere entirely different than it had been 10 seconds ago. He'd moved, fast and quiet. Came from the direction of the water trough. "You've got 2 men down, Pike. The rest of you boys, you want to think about what you're getting paid against what you're risking." One of the remaining riders, she could hear it, the horse shifting, the creak of a man reconsidering, started backing his horse toward the gate. "Don't you move!" Pike shouted. The man moved. He turned his horse and went back through the gate at a canter, and that was 4, which left Pike and 2 others. Pike got off his horse. That was the moment Abigail's stomach truly dropped, because a man who gets off his horse in the middle of a night fight has made a decision that goes past strategy into something personal. And she watched through the shutter crack as Pike pulled a shotgun from his saddle scabbard and walked toward the cabin with it. And there was something in the way he moved, slow, deliberate, almost calm, that was far more frightening than the charge had been. "Mrs. Turner," his voice was conversational, almost gentle. "I have got no personal quarrel with you. I want you to understand that. This is business. This is Mr. Calloway's business, and you have put yourself between me and the completion of it, and that is the entire problem." He stopped about 15 feet from the door. "Come out now. I will put you on a horse and you will ride north, and you will not come back. That is the last decent offer you will ever receive." Abigail pressed her back against the interior wall beside the door. Her hands were steady. She was surprised by that. "Mr. Pike," she said through the door, her voice clear and level. "My husband is buried 30 feet from where you're standing. He was shot on this land. I am not leaving this land." She paused. "And if you come through that door, I will empty both barrels into you before you get the first foot across the threshold." A pause. "Have it your way," Pike said. She heard him rack the shotgun. She heard something else, too, a sound she didn't immediately identify, a kind of scuffle and a grunt, and then a heavy impact, and then silence. Then Cole's voice. "Pike!" She looked through the shutter crack. Cole had come out of the dark on Pike's left side while he was talking to the door. Close, inside the reach of the shotgun. Close enough that when he'd grabbed the barrel and twisted it upward and driven his elbow into Pike's jaw, the whole sequence had taken less than 2 seconds. Pike was on the ground on his back, the shotgun several feet away in the dirt, and Cole was standing over him with his pistol out and his voice as even as if he were discussing the weather. "Don't," Cole said. Pike looked up at him from the ground. His gray hat was in the dirt. Without it, he looked older, less certain. The 2 remaining riders looked at each other, looked at Pike on the ground, looked at Cole. One of them turned his horse and rode out the gate without a word. The second followed 3 seconds later. Pike started to sit up. "Stay down," Cole said. "You've made an enemy tonight," Pike said. His voice was tight, a cord pulled close to snapping. "You understand what Calloway will do? To you? To her? To every person who's talked to her?" "I understand what Calloway has already done," Cole said. "And I understand that tonight 2 of your men are down, and the rest rode away, and there's a sheriff in Cheyenne right now with enough paper to end Victor Calloway's operation permanently." He crouched down to Pike's level. "So you think very carefully about the next thing you say, because you are going to need to decide whether you're the man who hangs for Calloway's orders, or the man who is just following instructions." Pike stared at him. Something moved through the foreman's face, something that started as fury and traveled a long road toward fear. "You're bluffing," Pike said. "Brooks wouldn't ride against Calloway." "He rode last night,"
Cole said. At midnight. He took signed statements from 2 witnesses and every document Mrs. Turner had. He'll be in Cheyenne by tomorrow morning. He held Pike's eyes. How confident are you that Calloway will protect you when the territorial court comes knocking? The silence that followed was a different kind than before. It was the silence of a man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the answer. Abigail unbarred the door and stepped onto the porch with a shotgun, and she looked down at Ethan Pike in the dirt of the yard she had defended. And she felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite grief. Something that lived in the space between them, the particular feeling of having held when everything said to let go. "Get up," she said. Pike got up slowly. "You and your men are going to leave this property," she said. "You're going to tend to your wounded. And tomorrow morning, if you decide you want a future that doesn't end in a federal prison, you're going to think very hard about everything you know and who you might want to share it with." Pike looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was already swelling where Cole had hit it. His hat was still in the dirt. He bent and picked up his hat without being told to, set it on his head, walked to his horse, and mounted with the stiff movements of a man holding himself together by will alone. He looked at her from the saddle. "You know this isn't over," he said. "Everything ends eventually, Mr. Pike," she said. "Even men like Calloway." He rode out the gate. She watched him go. And then her knees did the thing she'd been preventing them from doing for the past 40 minutes. They buckled slightly, the smallest betrayal, and she put her hand on the porch post to steady herself, and she breathed. Cole was beside her before she'd finished the breath, not touching her, just there. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." A pause. "No." Another pause. "Ask me tomorrow." "Fair enough." She looked at the yard. The dropped torch burned out in the dirt, the scuff marks where Pike had gone down, the gateposts standing solid in the dark. Everything was still there. The cabin was still there. The grave was still there. She was still there. "The man near the well," she said. "Is he—" "Alive. Wing shot. He'll need a doctor." She nodded. "Get him to the barn. I'll see to him." Cole looked at her. "Abigail," he said. First time he'd used her given name. It landed different than she expected. She met his eyes. "You should be proud of yourself," he said quietly. Thomas would be. She felt the tears come then, not a flood, just a few, quick and hot and unexpected. The kind that had been waiting behind a door she'd been bracing shut since the morning she'd driven the last shovelful of earth over her husband's grave. She didn't turn away from them this time. She let them come, standing straight on her own porch with the shotgun in her hands, and Cole stood beside her and didn't say anything else, which was exactly the right thing. After a minute, she wiped her face with the back of her wrist. "Get him inside," she said, meaning the wounded man. "There's clean cloth under the kitchen shelf." "Yes, ma'am." She stood there alone for a moment after Cole moved away. She looked up at the sky, enormous, crowded with stars, the way it always was out here, the kind of sky that made everything feel very small and very large at the same time. She thought about Thomas. "Too big to be sad in," he'd said. She understood it now in a way she hadn't before. It wasn't that the sky cured grief. It was that the sky reminded you that what you were doing here, holding on, refusing, standing when everything said lie down, that it mattered. That it was part of something larger than one woman on 40 acres fighting a man with a county in his pocket. It was the whole long argument between the powerful and the ones who wouldn't move. And she was still standing on the right side of it. She turned and went inside.
Behind her, somewhere south on the road to Calloway Ranch, Ethan Pike rode alone in the dark. And for the first time in 15 years of doing Victor Calloway's work, he rode without certainty. And in a hotel room in Cheyenne, Daniel Brooks sat at a desk with 2 oil lamps burning and laid out every document Abigail Turner had given him, and began to write, in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who was done pretending he didn't know the difference between law and power. The night stretched on, but something had cracked open in it that couldn't be closed again. The wounded man's name was Carl Briggs, and he was 22 years old and scared half to death. He lay on the kitchen floor with his back against the wall and his right arm wrapped in clean cotton while Abigail tied off the bandage, and he looked at her with the expression of a man expecting punishment and receiving something he didn't have a category for. Cole stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching. "I didn't want to come tonight," Carl said. It wasn't an excuse. It came out like a confession, the kind a person makes when they've stopped calculating what it costs them. "I know," Abigail said. She pulled the knot tight. He winced. "Pike said if we didn't ride, we'd lose our pay and our bunk both." "Pike said a lot of things tonight," Cole said from the doorway. Carl looked at him. "Is he going to come back?" "Not tonight," Cole said. "Maybe not ever. Depends on how smart he is." "He's not that smart," Carl said. Then, quieter, "But Calloway is." The room went still. Abigail sat back on her heels and looked at the young man against her wall. "What do you mean by that?" she said. Carl turned his hat over in his good hand. "I mean that Pike was always the fist. Calloway's the head. You stopped the fist tonight, ma'am, and I'm glad you did, God's honest truth. But Calloway doesn't need Pike. He's got lawyers in Cheyenne. He's got a territorial congressman who came to dinner at the ranch house twice this spring." He met her eyes. "He's going to fight what that sheriff is bringing him with paper, not guns." Abigail stood. She looked at Cole. Cole looked back at her with an expression that said he'd already been thinking the same thing, and hadn't wanted to say it until after she'd gotten through the night. "What kind of lawyers?" Cole said. "Good ones. The kind you hire when you know you're eventually going to need them." Carl shifted his back against the wall. "There's a man named Aldous Fitch. Comes up from Denver twice a year. I've heard Calloway mention him by name when he thought no one was listening." He paused. "Last time was 2 weeks ago." Abigail walked to the window. The yard was quiet. The gate stood open still, and the ground was marked where the night had happened, and Thomas's grave was a dark shape in the starlight. And she looked at all of it and thought about lawyers in Denver and congressmen at dinner tables and the distance between a woman with $31 in a tin box and the machinery of men who had decided she should not exist on this land. "Get some sleep," she told Carl. "You can bed in the barn. Your horse is in the paddock." He blinked. "You're letting me stay?" "I'm not turning out a wounded man in the middle of the night," she said. "Whatever you rode here as, you're just a boy with a hole in your arm right now." She looked at him steadily. "Come morning, you'll need to decide what comes next. That's your business. But tonight, you stay." He stared at her like he was trying to solve something. "Thomas was right about you," he said quietly. "I heard him tell Pike once. He said his wife had more backbone than anyone in the valley." He swallowed. Pike laughed. "I didn't." She didn't answer, but something in her chest moved. Cole helped Carl to the barn and came back and found Abigail at the table with the oil lamp and a piece of paper and a pen, writing. "What are you doing?" he said. "Writing to Mary. She needs to know what Carl told us about Fitch and the congressman. If Brooks is walking into a legal ambush in Cheyenne, he needs to know who he's walking into it against." She didn't look up. "I need someone to ride to town before sunrise." "I'll go."
I need you here. Carl can ride. She looked up. Can we trust him? She asked. Cole considered it. His arm's going to hurt like hell tomorrow, and he's got nowhere to go. And he just told you information that could get him fired and blacklisted from every ranch in Wyoming. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Yeah, I think we can trust him. She finished the letter, sealed it with candle wax, and wrote Mary Caldwell's name on the front. Then she sat back and rubbed her eyes with both hands, and for a moment she was just tired. Not frightened, not strategic, just a woman who hadn't slept properly in a week and had just survived something she was still processing. Calloway's going to come himself, she said. Isn't he? Once he hears tonight failed. Probably. Not with Riders. With that lawyer. Probably, Cole said again. Which is why we need Brooks to get to the right people, before Fitch gets to the wrong ones. It's a race, she said. It's been a race since the day you didn't leave when Pike told you to. She looked at him across the table. Are you sorry you stayed? She asked. It came out more direct than she'd planned, and she didn't soften it. Cole didn't look away. No, ma'am, he said. Not for a single day of it. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she folded her hands on the table. In the morning, she said. I need to go to town. He straightened slightly. Abigail, I know. But there are people in Redridge who have been watching this from behind their curtains for months. Carl said it himself. Tonight is the first time Calloway's operation has visibly failed in this valley in 20 years. People have been waiting for a reason to believe it was possible. She pressed her palms flat on the table. I want to give them that reason before Calloway's version of tonight reaches them first. Cole was quiet for a moment. You want to walk into town the morning after 6 armed men tried to burn your property and stand in the street? I want to walk into town, she said, and let them see that I'm still standing. He looked at her for a long time. All right, he said finally. But I'm riding beside you. She almost argued, decided not to. All right, she said. She went to bed. He stayed at the table. Neither of them slept much. By the time the sun was an hour up, Carl Briggs was on a horse headed toward town, with a letter tucked in his good hand and a look of fragile determination on his young face. Abigail and Cole rode 20 minutes behind him at an unhurried pace, side by side on the south road, and the morning was bright and breathless, and smelled of dry grass and distance. They were half a mile from Redridge when they heard the rider coming hard from the north. Cole had his rifle up before the rider came around the bend, but it was a single horse, fast and aimed straight at them. And when the rider pulled up in a spray of dust, Abigail recognized the face. It was a deputy. Young, maybe 25, with a badge and a frightened look, and a letter in his outstretched hand. Mrs. Turner, he said, I've been riding since before dawn. Sheriff Brooks sent this. She took the letter, broke the seal, read it, then read it again. Cole watched her face. What does it say? He said. She looked up. The territorial court issued a writ this morning, she said. Her voice was steady, but she could hear something shaking behind it, something that had been braced against collapse for so long it didn't quite know how to stop bracing. Calloway's land acquisitions are under formal investigation. The banknote is frozen pending review. No property transfers can be executed during the investigation. She lowered the letter. I keep the land. Until the court decides, I keep it. The deputy nodded. Sheriff Brooks said to tell you he'll be back in Redridge in 2 days. He said to tell you... He hesitated, like he was reciting something he'd been made to memorize. He said to tell you that the law works slow, but it's still the law, and he intends to remind people of that from now on. She folded the letter. She didn't cry.
She'd used those up last night. She just sat on horseback in the morning sun on the road to Redridge, with a letter in her hand that said she had won the first round, and she breathed in and breathed out and let it be real. "Let's go to town," she said. They rode in at a walk. What happened in Redridge that morning was not a parade, and it was not a celebration. It was quieter than that, and more important. Abigail Turner rode down the main street of the town that had crossed the street to avoid her, and she sat straight in the saddle, and she looked at the people on the boardwalks looking back at her, and she didn't stop, and she didn't hurry. And Cole Hawkins rode beside her and said nothing, which was the right thing. But things happened. The woman who ran the dry goods store, who had not spoken to Abigail since October, stepped off the boardwalk and said, "I heard what happened last night. I'm glad you're all right." Short, stiff, but real. The man who ran the feed store looked out his window, and then looked away, and then looked back, and gave a slow, single nod. A group of men outside the livery stable stopped talking when she rode by. One of them, old, weathered, a rancher she didn't know, took off his hat. Small things. But she was a woman who understood what small things cost in a town that had been paying a different kind of price for 20 years. They stopped at Mary Caldwell's house. Mary came to the door before they knocked, like she'd been watching for them, and she had Carl Briggs's letter already open in her hand and her coat already on. "I've been up since 4, she said. "I wrote to a man I know at the Cheyenne newspaper last night. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure it was the right move." She looked at Abigail. "Was it the right move?" Abigail considered it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I think it was. He's a good journalist. He's been looking for something to write about Calloway for 2 years. He just needed someone to go on record." She paused. "I went on record." Cole let out a slow breath. "That changes things." "It changes everything," Mary said. "A legal investigation is one thing. Calloway's lawyers can slow that down for years. But a newspaper story..." She shook her head. "You can't sue a story into silence once it's printed. People read it. People talk. The congressman who came to dinner starts thinking about his next election." Abigail looked at her. "Mary," she said, "you understand what he'll do when he finds out." "I do." She straightened. "I've been the school teacher in this town for 11 years. I know every child of every family in this valley. Calloway can take my position. He cannot take what those children already know about right and wrong." She met Abigail's eyes. "I taught them. I should live up to it." That was the moment Abigail felt it. The thing she hadn't known she was waiting for. Not safety, not victory. The feeling of not being alone. After months of standing on 40 acres with nothing but Thomas's rifle and her own refusal, the sensation of other people putting their weight on the same side was almost physical. Like a wall she'd been holding with her bare hands finally had other hands on it. She had to look away for a moment. They were at the door of the sheriff's office an hour later. Not to report anything, but because the deputy had told them the acting deputy in charge needed the writ copy filed locally. When Calloway's private coach came up the main street. Everyone on the boardwalk saw it. The black coach, the matched team, the Calloway Ranch brand on the door panel. It pulled up in front of the hotel, and Victor Calloway stepped out, and he was everything his reputation said. Big, well-dressed, moving with the deliberate ease of a man who had never in his life needed to hurry, because the world rearranged itself in front of him. He saw Abigail the moment his feet hit the ground. She was standing in front of the sheriff's office with Cole beside her, and the writ copy in her hand. And she looked at Victor Calloway across the main street of Redridge, and she did not look away. Calloway stopped. Just for a moment. A man used to controlling rooms and roads and conversations. And he stopped. And something moved behind his eyes. Quick and cold
and recalculating. And then he moved on toward the hotel entrance. "He knows," Cole said quietly. "He knows," she agreed. "He's not done." "Neither am I." They stood there until the hotel door closed. Then Cole turned to her. "We need to get back to the property," he said.
"He's going to make a move today. Not guns, not tonight. Something legal. He'll have Fitch on a horse by noon." She was already turning toward the horses. But then a voice behind her said, "Mrs. Turner." She turned. It was a man she didn't recognize, 40, slight, with city clothes and careful eyes, and a leather satchel tucked under his arm. He had the look of a man who measured things before he touched them. "My name is Gerald Holt," he said. "I practice law out of Laramie. I read the brief that came through the territorial court this morning." He paused. "I've been waiting to read something like it for a long time." He held out a card. "I'd like to represent you, Mrs. Turner. Pro bono. In full." She stared at him. "Why?" she said. He smiled, small, dry, like a man who respected the directness. "Because Victor Calloway destroyed a client of mine 8 years ago in Carbon County, and I've been looking for a clean case against him ever since." He tipped his head toward the hotel. "And because what your sheriff brought to Cheyenne yesterday isn't just a clean case. It's the cleanest I've ever seen." He held her gaze. "Let me take this the rest of the way." Cole looked at Abigail. She looked at the card. Then she looked at the hotel door that had closed behind Victor Calloway. She thought about Thomas at this table the first winter, cursing at wood that split wrong, laughing at himself when the legs came out uneven. She thought about $31.40 in a tin box. She thought about a grave mound dark against pale earth, and a boy named Jesse who'd burned his safest bridge for a woman he barely knew, and a school teacher who'd gone on record, and a sheriff riding through the night with oilskin-wrapped papers in his coat. She took the card. "When can you start?" she said. "I already have," Gerald Holt said. Behind them, the hotel door opened again. Calloway's man, not Calloway himself, someone she didn't recognize, walked out and looked directly at her and Cole, and then at the lawyer beside them. And he looked just long enough to see what he needed to see. Then he went back inside. "They know you have counsel," Cole said. "Good," she said. She slipped the card into her coat pocket beside the writ copy, and she turned toward her horse, and she felt, for the first time since a summer morning when she'd stood over her husband's grave with a shovel in her hands, the particular sensation of the ground shifting in the right direction. She mounted. Cole mounted beside her. "Abigail," he said. She looked at him. "This isn't over," he said. Same words Pike had used, but in Cole's voice they meant something entirely different. Not a threat, not a warning. A promise. "I know," she said. She touched her heels to the horse and rode back toward her land. Gerald Holt worked fast. Abigail learned this about him within 48 hours. He was the kind of man who slept 4 hours and spent the other 20 moving paper from one place to another with surgical precision. And every piece of paper he moved cost Victor Calloway something. By the second morning after the night attack, Holt had filed 3 separate motions with the territorial court, subpoenaed the Red Ridge Agricultural Bank's transaction records for the previous 18 months, and sent a formal letter of inquiry to the congressional office in Washington that named the congressman who had dined twice at Calloway Ranch. He sat at Abigail's kitchen table and explained it to her in plain language, which she appreciated. "Calloway's lawyer, Fitch, is good," Holt said. "Don't underestimate him.
He's going to try to challenge the standing of Brooks's filing on procedural grounds.
He'll argue that a county sheriff doesn't have the authority to petition the territorial court directly without going through the county attorney first.
And does he?
Cole asked from the doorway.
In a normal circumstance, arguably not. But the county attorney is demonstrably compromised, which I will demonstrate, which means Brooks had no clean channel through which to file and acted in the only way available to him. Holt looked up from his papers. It's not ironclad, but it's solid enough to hold while the investigation proceeds. Abigail poured him another coffee without being asked. "What about Calloway himself?" she said. "Can he be arrested?" "Not yet. Not until the investigation concludes and the court makes a finding." Holt wrapped both hands around the cup. "But here's what matters right now. The Cheyenne newspaper ran Mary's story this morning." Cole straightened. "How bad is it for Calloway?" Abigail said. "It's 4 columns on the front page," Holt said.
"It names him by name. It names Pike by name. It names the congressman by name." He paused. "By noon today, every rancher in Wyoming will have read it or heard about it. And by tomorrow, the territorial governor will be asked about it at his weekly address." Abigail set down the coffee pot. "The governor," she said. "Elections are in 14 months, Holt said simply. "Politicians read newspapers." She looked at Cole. He looked back at her with an expression that was the closest she'd ever seen him come to hope. Then the sound of hoofbeats in the yard, multiple horses, moving fast, and both of them were at the window in the same instant, Cole with his hand on his rifle. But it was Daniel Brooks, and he had 2 men with him, wearing badges she didn't recognize. Federal badges. She was at the door before they dismounted. "Marshal's office," Brooks said by way of greeting. He looked tired, in the way of a man who'd ridden hard and slept little, and was somewhere on the other side of it. "Mrs. Turner, these are Deputy U.S. Marshals Tanner and Cole." He caught himself. "Tanner and Webb. They've come down from Cheyenne with me." The taller of the 2 marshals, Tanner, broad-shouldered, with a precise mustache and no wasted movement, stepped forward and touched his hat. "Ma'am, we've been briefed on the situation. We're here to serve a formal notice of federal investigation on Victor Calloway and to take custody of Ethan Pike." He looked at her steadily. "Do you know his current whereabouts?" "Last I saw him, he rode south toward Calloway Ranch," she said. 3 nights ago." "He's still there," Carl Briggs said from the corner of the porch, and everyone looked at him. He'd stayed. 3 days now, sleeping in the barn, fixing small things around the property without being asked, finding reasons not to leave. "He hasn't left the ranch since that night. I know a man who's still on the payroll who told me yesterday." Marshal Tanner looked at Carl for a moment, assessing. "You're willing to give a statement?" he said. Carl glanced at Abigail. She gave him a small nod. "Yes, sir," he said. "I am." Brooks looked at Abigail. "We're going to Calloway Ranch this morning," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know." "It may get complicated." "I imagine it will." He held her eyes for a moment. "I owe you more than an apology, Mrs. Turner. I owe you about 8 months of it. I'm not going to pretend that 2 marshals and a newspaper story makes up for that." "No," she said. "It doesn't." She looked at him steadily. "But it's a start, Sheriff." Something in his face changed. Not released exactly, but shifted. Like a man who'd been carrying a thing at arm's length and had finally decided to hold it properly. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "It is." They rode for Calloway Ranch at 8 in the morning. Brooks, the 2 marshals, Cole, and Holt, who insisted on coming, and sat on a borrowed horse with his leather satchel strapped across his back like a soldier's kit. Abigail watched them ride out from the gate, and then stood in the yard alone for a moment, with her hands at her sides. The yard was quiet. The summer morning pressed down warm and clean and enormous. She went inside and waited. That was the hardest thing she'd done yet. She cleaned the kitchen. She restacked the shelf. She swept the floor that didn't need sweeping. She went to the window 4 times in the first hour and made herself go back to the table each time because watching the road wouldn't make them return faster, and she knew it. Mary arrived at 10 with 2 other women, a rancher's wife from the north end of the valley named Clara Hobbs, and the woman from the dry goods store whose name was Ruth, who had spoken to Abigail on the street and seemed to be working through the geometry of that decision still. Quiet, but present. They sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and didn't talk about what was happening at Calloway Ranch, which was exactly the right choice. Ruth spoke first, after a long silence. "My husband told me not to come," she said. She was looking at her cup. "He said we don't know how this ends, and we shouldn't be on the wrong side of it if it ends badly." Nobody said anything. "I told him," Ruth continued, "that I've been on the wrong side of it for 8 months already, and I was sick of the view." She looked up at Abigail. "I'm sorry it took me this long." Abigail thought about what Thomas had said. The good ones don't bend. And she thought about how that wasn't quite right. The good ones bent. They bent under pressure, and under fear, and under the weight of families and positions and futures they were trying to protect. The difference wasn't bending. The difference was whether you came back. "You're here now," Abigail said. "That's what I've got." Clara set down her cup with a definite sound. "What do you need, practically speaking? The barn's burned and the fences. What do you need?" Abigail looked at her. "I need the barn rebuilt," she said. "And I need the east fence restrung. And I need—" She stopped, something tight in her throat. "I need people to not cross the street anymore." Clara nodded. "My husband and 2 of our ranch hands can be here Saturday." Ruth said, "My boy's 17 and strong." Mary said, "I'll bring food." Abigail looked at these 3 women sitting at Thomas's uneven table in her kitchen, and she felt something fracture quietly in the middle of her chest. Not break. Fracture. The difference being that a fracture is what happens to something that has been held rigid too long. And what comes after is not collapse, but release. She pressed her hand flat on the table. "Thank you," she said. That was all, but it carried everything. They were still at the table at noon when Cole rode back through the gate. Abigail was on the porch before he reached it. She read his face before he said a word. "Tell me," she said. He dismounted, stood in front of her with the reins in one hand and the dust of the ride still on him. And he looked at her with something in his eyes she hadn't seen there before. Not relief exactly, not triumph. More like the expression of a man who has seen the end of a very long road and is still deciding whether to believe it. "Pike is in federal custody," he said. "Arrested this morning on the ranch property. He didn't resist." Cole paused. I think he was almost relieved. "And Calloway?" "Served with the federal investigation notice. His lawyer was already there. Fitch, like Carl said." There was a considerable amount of noise. He turned his hat in his hand. But Holt had anticipated every argument Fitch made. Standing there, watching those 2 go at it was something. Fitch is good. Holt is better. She steadied herself with a hand on the porch post. "What happens to Calloway now?" she said. "He's not arrested yet. Holt says that comes later, maybe weeks from now, once the investigation finishes. But the federal notice means his land operations are frozen. He can't sell, transfer, foreclose, or execute any land agreements in this county, pending the outcome." Cole looked at her. He's still rich. He's still powerful. But for the first time in 20 years, he can't move. She let that sit.
"And the banknote?" she said.
Void. Holt filed the motion this morning on the basis of a fraudulent acquisition. Judge signed it in Cheyenne an hour later. He paused. Your land is yours, Abigail. Clear and legal and documented. The world went very quiet. She stood on the porch of Thomas's cabin, on Thomas's land, on a summer noon, and she heard a meadowlark somewhere in the field, and the sound of Mary's voice inside, saying something to Clara, and the wind moving through the cottonwoods at the north edge. And she stood in the middle of all of it, and let the reality of it move through her slowly, like water finding level. She didn't cry. She was done crying. Not because the grief was gone. It wasn't. It was going to live in her for a long time, the particular grief of a good man taken early. But because grief and what she was feeling right now were two different things occupying the same body, and she was large enough to hold both. "Cole," she said. "Ma'am?" "Come inside. I'll make lunch." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said. That afternoon, the yard filled up in a way it hadn't since before everything started. Jesse Pratt came by on a borrowed horse to hear the news, and stood in the doorway with his hat in both hands, looking younger than his age and older than it at the same time. Carl Briggs shook Jesse's hand in the yard, with the formality of two people who've been on opposite sides of something, and have decided they don't have to stay there. Brooks came back through at 4 in the afternoon to file some paperwork with Holt, and stayed for coffee, and sat at the table saying less than he should have, and meaning all of it. Mary and Clara and Ruth left at dusk, Clara squeezing Abigail's hand at the gate without saying anything, which was better than words. The yard emptied. The evening came in warm and gradual, the way summer evenings did out here, slowly pulling the heat back and replacing it with something gentler. Abigail stood at the fence at the north edge of the property and looked at the creek that ran along the eastern line. The creek that Thomas had refused to sign away, that had started all of it. And she listened to it running over the stones and thought about cost. She heard Cole's boots in the grass behind her. He stopped beside her at the fence, and they stood for a moment without speaking, looking at the creek. "What happens to you now?" she said. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she turned to look at him, "the reason you stayed. The thing you were settling with yourself about that woman in Millhaven. Is it settled?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "It is." "Then you'll go." He turned his hat over in his hands. "That's what I do," he said. "I know it is." Another silence. The creek ran. An owl called somewhere in the cottonwoods. "I don't want you to," she said. Cole went still. "Abigail, I'm not asking you for anything," she said quickly, firmly. "I'm not asking you to stay. I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I'm just—" She stopped, looked at the water. "I'm just telling you the truth, because you've been honest with me from the first morning, and it seems right to give it back." She looked at him. "I don't want you to go. That's a true thing. I'm done pretending true things aren't true because they're inconvenient." Cole stood very still. "I've been riding since 1865, he said. "That's 9 years of not staying anywhere long enough for it to matter whether I left." "I know. I'm not an easy man to—" "Cole." Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him. "I buried a good man 11 days ago. I am not looking for a replacement for Thomas. I am not looking for anyone to rescue me. I have a lawyer and a sheriff and a federal investigation, and come Saturday, half the valley is rebuilding my barn." She held his gaze. "What I'm looking for, what I think I might have found, is someone who looks at this land and doesn't see borrowed ground.
She paused. You said that. The first night. Do you remember? He looked at her. I remember, he said. Does it still feel that way? A long silence. The owl called again. Yeah, Cole said. His voice had gone quiet in a different way. It does. She turned back to the creek. Saturday, they're rebuilding the barn, she said. The east fence still needs a proper corner post, and I've got 40 acres that haven't been properly worked since March. She kept her eyes on the water. I'm not asking you to stay forever. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm just... She paused. The post-hole digger is in the lean-to. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then the smallest sound, something between a breath and a laugh, low and private. I can dig a post-hole, he said. She nodded. They stood at the fence a little longer in the cooling evening, side by side, not touching, watching the creek catch the last of the light. 3 days later, they broke ground on the new barn. Cole and Carl and Jesse, and 4 men from Clara Hobbs's ranch, and the dry goods store owner's 17-year-old son, who was indeed strong, as advertised. The frame went up in 2 days. It was bigger than the original, better seated on its foundation, the kind of structure built by people who had decided they were staying. Mary brought food both days, and sat on the fence and watched, and talked to Abigail about the newspaper story, which had run a follow-up piece, this one naming 3 additional properties Calloway had acquired through the same manufactured debt method. 2 of those families were already in contact with Gerald Holt. The congressman from Washington had issued a statement saying he had no comment on the investigation at this time. Holt had called this, in his dry, precise way, a very satisfying non-denial. Brooks arrested Ethan Pike formally on a Tuesday morning, charges of conspiracy to commit arson, assault, and accessory to murder. Pike had, as Cole had predicted, decided he preferred the role of man who was just following orders. His testimony, given in writing to the territorial court, named Calloway directly in the order to kill Thomas Turner. It was the thing they'd needed most, and hadn't been certain they'd ever get. On the morning after she heard about Pike's testimony, Abigail Turner walked out to the grave behind the cabin and stood there for a long time in the early summer light. "We got it, Thomas," she said. Her voice was steady. "The thing you didn't bend for. We got it." She put her hand on the marker Cole had made. Not fancy, solid, the kind that would hold through winter. "I'm going to be all right," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm going to be all right." She stood there a while longer. Then she heard the hammer start up at the barn, Cole's regular rhythm, the sound of work that was building something meant to last. And she turned around and walked back toward it. 6 weeks after Daniel Brooks rode through the night to Cheyenne with a packet of papers folded in oilskin, Victor Calloway was indicted on 11 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and land theft. His empire didn't collapse all at once. Empires rarely do. But it began the long process of coming apart at the seams. One deposition and one seized record and one former employee's testimony at a time. The valley looked different as summer turned. Not transformed, not healed. Places don't heal that fast from the damage powerful men do to them. But changed. The way a room changes when someone opens a window that has been painted shut for years. The way the air moves differently when there is suddenly somewhere for it to go. Redridge began, slowly and imperfectly, and with considerable awkwardness, to remember that it had a choice about who it was. And on 40 acres on the east edge of the valley, on land that had been fought for and held and finally secured in the name of a woman who had refused to leave it, the new barn stood solid against the sky. Abigail Turner stood in the doorway of her cabin one evening and watched Cole Hawkins come in from the fence line at the end of the day, hat in his hand, dust on his boots, moving with the particular ease of a man who has stopped counting the distance to the nearest road. He saw her watching and raised an eyebrow. "Post's in," he said. "I can see that." "Corner square." "I know. I checked." He laughed, a real one, the kind that had been coming more easily lately.
He came up to the porch and stopped at the step and looked at her. And she looked back at him. And between them was everything that had happened, and everything that hadn't happened yet, and the particular quality of an evening that has no hurry to it. "You hungry?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Come inside, then." She went in. He followed. The door closed behind them. On Thomas Turner's land, on the high plains of Wyoming, in the long light of a summer that had asked everything of a woman and received her answer. The answer was yes. She was still here. She had always been here. She was not going anywhere. The evening settled in like something finally, completely, irrevocably at rest. Some ground, once you've bled for it, becomes part of you. And some people, once they've stood beside you in the dark, are home.